Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Solving the Scope 3 Emissions Puzzle, another webinar in our Straight from the Horse's Mouth webinar series. And we'll be talking for about 30 minutes again this afternoon. My name is Barbara, and I'll be your host for today. I will provide a little short introduction to Scope 3 emissions, and then I'll hand over to our guest today, Jane Mansfield. Jane is General Manager for Quality, Environment and Sustainability at Asaleo Care and has been working in this field for 25 years. Before I hand over to Jane, I will give her a proper introduction. Before we get started, we'd really like to get to know our audience a bit and would like to hear a bit from you on what are your key challenges regarding Scope 3. Because then we might even be able to answer some of them. So I've launched a little poll. What are your key challenges around Scope 3? These are your key challenges. Don't know where to start. Most of you don't know what needs to be in and what can be left out. So we will provide a bit of guidance on this. Finding relevant emission factors, getting data from suppliers. These are very common topics that we hear, and it's far too complex. Yes, we hear that too, but we might be able to help you breaking it down into small elements. Now let's get started. I'll talk a little bit about Scope 3 emissions and generally what do we need to do? What is it all about? And just addressing your first question, what is in, what is out? The ISO standards are quite specific by saying everything that is significant. Now that doesn't really help, does it? Because what is significant? The one thing is there aren't actually any mandatory Scope 3 emissions because they are different for every business. And the definition of significance, I would see this as those emissions that contribute most, and you'd usually have a good feel for that, but also emissions that your stakeholders think are really important. I had a conversation with a large mining company recently, and they said, you know, business travel is just about 2% of our Scope 3 emissions. It doesn't feature in the big scheme of things. So we don't really have to report them, do we? Because they're not significant. And I said, well, your stakeholders will think they are really significant because travel and air travel emissions globally are very significant. So sometimes it is also important to put that global lens on it. If everyone expects you to report it, then it is significant in the views of the stakeholders. Generally speaking, it really is about avoiding burden shifting. An example, I visited a company, let's not name them, and it is a couple of years ago, and they were very proud when we did the site tour to tell me they had reduced their carbon emissions by 10% from their site because they don't do the washing of the overalls of their workers on site anymore, but they have outsourced it. That is why we need to do Scope 3 reporting. If we can see, oh, we could reduce our emissions by having someone else do that, those emissions need to be in. That's a very easy test. It's really about shifting burdens from one to another. And why is it so important? Well, for all of you who are keen to set a science-based target, there is a requirement to do a screening of your Scope 3 emissions. And before a science-based target is approved, they will check, have you done that screening? Having the screening not done, having the boundaries not right, are one of the reasons on why those targets don't get approved very often. So that's a real important driver to get started with your Scope 3 emissions. Now, breaking it down into smaller aspects. This is a graph that most of you would have seen looking at it from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Having said that, that is the old version, and the difference is quite small. It is just up here. Nitrogen trifluoride is a 7th group. And you go, oh, what is that gas? Do I need to include all of those gases? Do I need to include all the categories? There's a little bit of guidance here for you where those gases are important. If you, for example, are in the agricultural space, then nitrous oxide emissions would have to be in. Same with methane. If you use a lot of refrigerators, then all the HFC emissions would have to be in. So depending on what industry you are, you get a feeling for what emissions would have to be in. Most businesses wouldn't have to look at SF6 emissions, but if you are in electricity generation, it becomes quite relevant. Most of you wouldn't probably have to worry about this new category because it's only relevant if you are in the manufacture of electronics. And the categories, these are all the categories upstream and downstream. So as soon as you go, oh yep, we purchase lots of goods and services, then it probably is relevant. Lots of business travel. So these are the categories to go through, upstream and downstream. And that is really just a translation of that graph from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol a while ago prepared this overview. And that helps with that initial screening. Where do we start? What is relevant for us? And that depends largely, again, in what industry are you. If you are in the utility sector, 30% would, generally speaking, sit in your scope 1 and 2, purchase goods and services, fuel and energy upstream, and then the use of your product. You wouldn't have to worry so much about business travel unless your stakeholders expect it from you, or transport and distribution, or capital goods. It's a bit different if you're in the construction materials sector. Then your scope 1 and 2 are quite relevant still, but also the use of your products. Food and beverage, it would be purchased goods and services which are really relevant. That gives you a bit of an indication on where to start. Quick question here from someone. Could I outline what the origin of the term mandatory scope 3 emissions are? Where does it come from? Is it in the international standard? I did mention those at the very beginning. And if you are reporting just to the international ISO standard, there are no mandatory emissions. If you are reporting to a carbon reporting scheme and get certified, a certification scheme might have introduced mandatory emissions that are relevant for that specific certification scheme. That could be climate active in Australia or carbon zero in New Zealand. They might have set additional rules and make them mandatory for their specific scheme. But it's not in an international standard. The standard just refers to significant emissions. Coming back to what categories are relevant, CDP did a survey and looked at what over all industries are usually the most relevant scope 3 categories. And it is purchased goods and services, and it is the use of sold products. So those are really also good starting points, depending on what industry you are, to look at those two categories. That gives you a good start. So some scope 3 myth busted. I'll come back to the mandatory scope 3 emissions. And well, if I say there are no mandatory, I mean in relevance to the international standards. Different categories are relevant for different sectors, so no one has to report on all categories of scope 3 emissions. And significant really doesn't necessarily only refer to the amount of your emissions, but can be in the significant in the eyes of your stakeholders. One other thing that I often get asked is, but if everyone reports their scope 3 emissions, there will be lots of double counting. But it's not the aim of scope 3 reporting to get one full inventory for a country. It is the aim to show what emissions are you responsible for and what can you influence. And therefore, countrywide, if everyone reported all their scope 3 emissions, yes, there would be double counting. But that also means there is a lot of overlap, and it needs collaboration to bring those emissions down. And that's it from me. I will now hand over to Jane. Jane has been working in global supply chains for over 25 years, initially in the oil refining industry for 10 years, and in technical support and supply chain roles, and then in the fast-moving consumer goods industry in a range of related and mainly supply-related roles. Over the last 7 years, she's focused on corporate and brand sustainability. I find it always interesting to also see people's personal life coming into the job, and that's very much the case with Jane. Her personal life goal is to create a more sustainable society through business. And I think you might hear a little bit of that coming through in her presentation. And with that, over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and to thinkstep-anz for inviting me to share Asaleo Care's story in this webinar. I also want to thank everyone for dialing in. I personally see Scope 3 emissions management as a critical aspect of the UN SDG number 12. That's responsible consumption and production. It's right behind Barbara there on her shoulder. Everyone on the call has the capacity to nudge our procurement and operational processes towards the achievement of this global goal. And I hope this case study will help generate you some new insights about how you can make that happen. And that would make me personally very happy. What I'm going to do today in the time I've got is introduce Asaleo Care to you. I'm going to take you through how we developed our understanding of our own carbon story and what we learned along the way. And then I'll talk through two parts of our strategy to manage and reduce our Scope 3 emissions. Now, I'm going to preface all of this by saying that we haven't set Scope 3 targets, but I don't want that to discount what I am going to share with you today. We are very focused on reducing the carbon footprint of our products over the entire life cycle. In some respects, that's an easier task for us to tackle right now, and I would argue that it might be more impactful for us as an organisation at this stage of our journey. Well, you may not recognise our company name, Asaleo Care, but you will probably recognise our locally made Australian and New Zealand retail brands. We have a much more significant retail presence in New Zealand, where we've been manufacturing tissue paper and other products for more than 50 years. We also have a manufacturing site in Fiji. Our business-to-business brands represent the majority of our revenue, and you may already use some of our Tork branded product in your facilities and workplaces. And Asaleo Care was listed on the Australian Stock Exchange in 2014, and I've been managing the sustainability strategy for the business since that time. As a tissue paper manufacturer, we use a lot of energy in our paper mill, and it accounts for the majority of energy used across our entire enterprise. Understandably, that's where we started our carbon story within our own operations. And this slide reflects our operational journey. We divested an Australian tissue paper mill last year, and you can see the change in total energy consumed and the Scope 1 and 2 emissions from our operations. And this approach is quite typical to carbon footprinting in an operational or an industrial setting. You can also see that we use a geothermal steam energy source. This is actually a form of direct heat or thermal energy for us, and we started using it at our New Zealand-based paper mill in 2010. We were able to decommission fully a gas-fired boiler, and overnight we reduced our total site emissions by about 45% with that change. Using geothermal steam is unique in our industry. In fact, we think we are the only tissue paper mill in the world using this form of renewable energy. Additionally, the New Zealand electricity grid is very high in renewable generation sources. So we're thinking about hydro, geothermal, and increasingly wind. And that further delivers that low emissions energy for us. So with all of this in mind, we wanted to be able to tell our low carbon story to customers and consumers in a quantifiable way. And that's when we extended our scope from an operational basis to a value chain or a product life cycle. So we publish EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations, so that we can measure the impact of our products over their whole life cycle. And to be able to tell their story in an authentic, a credible and a transparent way. Our EPDs cover toilet paper, paper towel, so hand towel products, as well as some of our napkins. And they gave us the information we were looking for. That's the renewable energy share over the entire product life cycle, from forest to flush, as we like to say. But they also showed us where our actual and potential emissions could lie outside of our direct operational scope. And we didn't realise it, but we just ran our first Scope 3 footprint analysis. So that was the beginning of the next part of our journey. And this is the first part of our emissions reduction strategy for Scope 3 emissions. Through our various industry, investor, NGO, eco-label networks, we learned about the devastating social, environmental and economic impacts created when tropical peatlands are drained to make way for palm oil and pulpwood plantations. The frightening truth is that tissue paper products made from pulpwood sourced from drained Indonesian tropical peatlands are commonplace in supermarkets and workplace bathrooms across Australia and New Zealand today. We used our EPDs to model the climate change related impact and found that if we purchased pulp from these sources, which frankly is very economically attractive, then the carbon footprint of our products would increase by around 3 to 6 times. So what I do here is I like to imagine I'm holding a toilet paper roll. I envisage our carbon footprint for that toilet paper roll made at Carrall as a balloon, a black balloon. Then I imagine switching out the hardwood that's used to make that. That's not 100% of the pulp we use. We use a mix of softwood and hardwood to give it the qualities it needs. If we switch that out for another hardwood grown in a drained tropical peatland in Indonesia, that's where you start to see 3 to 6 balloons attached to that toilet paper. Now, I don't know about you, but as I said before, I've got a family of 4 that we are going through a lot of toilet paper. And as you know, there's a run on toilet paper in Melbourne at the moment. So that's a lot of balloons, which is a bit of a picture that you can sort of imagine in your own mind, and it's a bit frightening. We knew that we had to draw a line in the sand as an organisation and ensure that our products were not originating from these sources. It's just not in fitting with our approach to sustainability or our low carbon story. Now, the problem is that the practice of maintaining timber plantations on drained tropical peatlands is completely legal, and no forestry certification adequately protects against it. So in late 2017, we introduced our no tropical peatland policy, and we put all of our fibre sources and products through that due diligence process. We also talked to our customers about their paper purchasing choices and this issue. We work with our suppliers to understand their fibre sourcing supply chains, and we pay them adequately so they don't source from these forests. We advocate for all tissue paper brands operating in our market to make a public no tropical peatland commitment. So far, we are the only brand standing up on this issue. We raised this issue with the eco-label certification schemes, and we asked them what they can do about it. And I think these could be the most important steps we take in the next 3 to 5 years as a company to help create a more sustainable society. Now, the other part of our Scope 3 is downstream. To be honest, it was a bit of a shock for us when we saw the end-of-life impact of our paper hand towel. This is from a Tork product, but it equally applies to a handy product or very similar. We had reduced our operational greenhouse gas emissions to such an extent that the end-of-life impacts looked enormous, and they do still look enormous. The fact is that other manufacturers probably have a much more significant tissue production greenhouse gas footprint. And as we know, if we were using fibre from Australian tropical peatland, as some of our competitors do, then the end of life impact would be dwarfed by the pulp related impacts. But we're not comparing ourselves to others. We're comparing our current footprint to what it could be. So we started to think about alternative realities. Together with ThinkStep, we thought about what could reduce our end-of-life impact, and we found that we sort of started playing around the idea of composting. We had been exploring that for a while, and it really was an exciting insight for us when we started to do the analysis in our latest EPDs. We've actually got that as published EPD impact. If we reduce the carbon footprint through composting at product end of life. So that's a really exciting insight for us. So this is at Bank of New Zealand, who have been working with us and Hungry Bins, which is the provider of these modular worm bins. And they have this in their car park. And they have found that a mix of 50% paper towels from their bathrooms and kitchenettes, along with 50% of food, again, from their kitchenettes throughout their floors, is the perfect mix for these happy worms. That's an idea that you can definitely take away and think about implementing as part of your green teams and any other facility management type processes you've got underway. So thank you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Jane. I always, again, enjoy listening to that story because I think it really is a very good example of how to really manage, first identify and then manage that carbon footprint and come up with a practical way of reducing. We do now have time for some questions, and I can see there are already two. How has COVID and hygiene impacted on the end of life use options?
Because at the moment, most paper towel is currently sent to landfill. There hasn't been a change, but certainly with the increased focus on hygiene, particularly in healthcare settings and workplaces, there will be more tissue paper products, hygiene products used. The issue I think you might be alluding to is hygiene issues. We haven't come across any yet, and you would think that that could be managed on a site-by-site basis. So I don't have anything else to talk about on that issue at this time. We'll certainly have more next year, I think.
Someone else is asking, does hand sanitizer affect the potential to compost the hand towels?
It's a good question. I think it would depend on the MSDS of the actual hand sanitizer that you are using. If it's an alcohol and biodegradable product, you would think that wouldn't be an issue, but often with hand sanitizer, you actually don't use it with paper towel at all. You actually use it in a dry zone. So I don't think there'd be a problem or a complication there.
Someone says, I like the Bank of New Zealand use of worm farms, so thank you for that comment.
It's pretty cool.
I think it really shows that even if you are not somewhere out in the countryside, you really can do composting. I think that's a very good example. I have another comment maybe that Jane, from when we talked earlier, or probably even last year, we talked about ISO 14000 certification as well, because it has that sort of life cycle aspect to it. And it also means that some of your clients might be doing that. So have you used the EPDs and also communicating carbon in that context?
Yes, so we do. It depends a lot on our customer. For instance, like with a 14001, that can be if it's a material issue for them, they will start managing that. But mainly, we have been communicating the carbon footprint of our products sold to them if they've decided that it is a scope 3. And if you're thinking about potentially a healthcare setting, it is quite significant.
So you're basically able to help with this, reduce your clients' carbon footprints then as well.
Absolutely. And, being able to provide that information in a transparent way and a verified way, because the EPDs are verified and they're public, it gives a lot of credibility to that data, which I think is really important in today's world. People want to be able to include this in their own annual reports, and they need verifiable, auditable data.
We have time for two more. Do you have any advice on how to approach suppliers in regards to their emissions if they're not looking at it themselves already?
That's a really interesting question. There's two ways of doing that. Well, there's three ways. Do nothing, go hard, or go soft. Our approach has been to go soft in terms of working with our suppliers. We could not publish our EPDs without the very generous time and effort that our suppliers put into the process every 3 years or so. And so that's absolutely critical. We see it as part of our relationship management with those suppliers. In terms of going hard, there are certain suppliers we will not even consider as a result of their practices. So the way we describe it is that if our suppliers cannot or are unwilling to meet our requirements, then we will end our relationship with them. So that's the approach we use. We try and use dialogue wherever possible, and also communicating why it's important for us and why it's important for our customers. That's always part of the discussion.
We'll take one last one. It's one that comes up very, very often. Has anyone done an LCA on paper towels versus hand dryers? And I can say I've been doing that example for years when I've worked with students, and I haven't got a clear-cut answer for you, because it really depends very much on also where you are, what the electricity mix is. If you did this in New Zealand with 85% green electricity, the picture would look very, very different to, say, Victoria, where there is a lot of coal in the electricity mix. And LCA looks also only at one aspect, because you actually really dry your hands usually with a paper towel, whereas electricity very often just takes too long and you just sort of have wet hands. And currently, with our requirements to wash our hands properly, have to take that into account as well.
Yes, I think the hygiene issues are the primary concern, particularly in the environment we're in right now. So I would actually look at that as the first criteria.
Yeah. Don't have time for any more questions right now. We will, if there are more, yes, I can see one more, but we will get back to you in writing afterwards, because we have to wrap it up here. There are a few more webinars coming in July. So we talk about circular economy, product stewardship, and an industry approach to sustainability in our upcoming webinars. Thanks again very much to Jane for sharing your story. I think it's really inspiring, and we're looking forward to seeing you all next time. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.